Hello art students, I hope you're having a great day. Today we're going to be getting into monoprinting, what monoprinting is, and our assignment for tomorrow. So you should have already watched the video through Edpuzzle discussing what exactly is printmaking. So that should give you an idea of what we're going to be doing for our first unit. Printmaking, as you know, is transferring an image from one surface to another. And monoprinting is really the most simple method of printmaking. So I'm going to show you a little bit about what monoprinting is and then how we monoprint. First thing we're going to do when you come into class is we're going to tape or glue with a glue stick this learning guide into our sketchbook. Okay, you can simply do this by taping the four corners down with a little bit of tape, or if you prefer to use the glue stick, that would also be great. But that is the very first thing we're going to do before we get started with class, is get that taped into your sketchbook so you have all the information ready to go in your sketchbook. If you're learning at home, just access the guides through Schoology. You're going to need a lot of materials to do monoprinting. One thing you're going to need is a plexiglass plate. These can be found by the windows near the sink. You're also going to need to get your brushes out of your art kit, so these would be perfect to use for this. You will probably also need to access your palette knife, some water, the watercolor set that is in your art kit as well, and then you're also going to need some acrylic paint also. So this is the palette that I got, but you can get whatever colors you want. Please note how much paint I got, about a dime size amount. We do not need blobs and blobs of paint. You will not use that much, and remember, at the end of the period it gets thrown in the trash can. So please only get out what you need, and you can always go back and get more. The item you're going to need is a lot of paper to print on. Okay? And you can get whatever kind of papers you want. I'm going to print on some some scrapbooking paper, some construction colored paper. I have some watercolor paper here. I also have some old map paper that I got out of the bins in the back. And I also got out this magazine cover with these interesting looking people on them. So I'm going to print on all different types of paper, and I would encourage you to do the same thing. Step away from just using the white paper and print on any sort of paper surface that you can. I'm going to show you monoprinting in its most basic form, and I'm going to use the acrylic paint to demonstrate this. So I have my palette here, and I'm going to lay some color down onto my plate. Remember, the brushes that are a little bit more firm are good for acrylic paint, and the brushes that are more soft are good for your watercolor. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and lay some of this paint onto my plastic plexiglass plate. Okay. And the purpose of monoprinting is to give you a very loose product. Okay? You can't really control it, and the results will vary each time you print. Okay? So you can add water. You could potentially spray it if you want it to have a more transparent quality. You could lay the paint on very thick. Okay? But notice I'm not really painting anything. I'm just laying down color. I'm not trying to create any imagery, although you could. Okay? This is a process that really leaves the interpretation up to the artist. Okay? All right, I'm going to lay some thicker paint down here on the bottom. Okay, splits here. All right, I'm going to show you the first one on plain white paper, just because it's the easiest to see. And I'm going to lay dry paper on top, although I could potentially spray with water if I wanted a different effect. Okay? So monoprinting is simply transferring material from one area to another. In this case, it's acrylic paint being transferred to paper from a plexiglass plate. Okay? And just lightly use your fingers here to transfer. Okay. When I'm done, I'm going to pull the image. Okay. Pulling is another word for printing. I'll lift up, and here are my results. Okay. Don't expect there to be an image that comes out. We are just making paper. This is a monoprint, okay? So it's completely fluid and unpredictable. Because I still have quite a bit of paint left on my plate, I'm going to go ahead and print again using what I still have. This is called a ghost image, which is printing a monoprint multiple times, okay? And here I'm going to spritz again, and this time I'm going to try and use my colored construction paper. Okay, it's going to just have a very different effect. And I'm going to go ahead and pull, okay, and I've gotten a totally different image than my first print. This is known as your ghost print. All right, let me show you a variation on that. Notice that I've cleaned my plate because I'm going to use some new colors here, and I'm going to continue on using my acrylic paint. Okay. I've created some new colors. Remember, you can always mix colors. Do not feel like you need to use the color directly from the bottle. Okay, so I mix these colors using my palette knife. It does create richer, more interesting colors if you mix them and don't use them directly from the tube or the bottle. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and lay on some of these colors that I mixed just like I did last time. Okay. This time I'm going to cover a little bit more thick of an application of paint. Now that I've covered my plate, some things I can do is create some interesting textures into my paint for transferring. A fork is a great object to use, especially if you're at home and you don't have a lot of texture makers. Okay? A fork will create some really interesting textures into that paint. I do have multiple texture makers in the room, so you could also use them to kind of scrape away the paint to create some interesting textures. A Q-tip is also a great tool, and I have tons of them. If you would like to use a Q-tip to kind of just take away the paint, draw into it, that is another thing you can use. Toothpicks are also wonderful tools for creating line texture into your paint. Okay. Another thing I have are many plastic stencils. So if you were to lay a stencil in before you printed, that would also kind of create a really interesting effect. So I'm going to lay that on there. And now I'm ready to print. You could spray this with water. You could spray your paper with water. You don't have to. I'm not going to because I want to keep some of my line work from bleeding. Okay, again, I'm going to press down. I'm going to use my hands in a circular motion to transfer the paint onto the paper. Again, this is called monoprinting. The reason it's called monoprinting is because you can only transfer one original. Okay? So you're not going to make multiple of the same things like you would with other printmaking methods. And the word mono in Latin means one. So that's where that term comes from, monoprinting. So think about that. You're only making one original print from the transfer. Okay? I'm going to go ahead and pull. Okay? And you can see what happened here. You can see where I needed to press down harder into this image where I had the stencil because it didn't transfer that because I didn't press enough into those spots. But you can see, however, where I did use the texture makers to create some interesting textured effects. Because I have a lot of leftover paint on here, I'm going to go ahead and create that ghost image again. And this time I might spray it a little bit, and this time I'm going to print over these lovely people here. Okay, lay it on. You know, magazine is a lot thinner than watercolor paper, so you got to be real gentle with some of these papers when you're transferring the paint onto them so they don't rip. Okay. I'm going to pull. And there's the effect I got there, which, you know, this could be great for collaging. This could be great for a lot of different things. I actually think they look a lot better with the paint over them than before anyway. I'm going to show you next printing with watercolor. Notice I have my plate is clean again. Okay, I'm going to use my watercolor palette. I'm going to use my soft brushes here. So this time I'm going to go ahead and paint something that's a little bit more recognizable onto my plate. Alright, you might have noticed that I'm using something that you haven't seen before. These are watercolors that are very concentrated, and they can be found over with the paint towards the bottom, and they're great for creating monoprints too. They're just liquid watercolor in a bottle. You can draw with them. You can also use your brush and dip it into them and move the paint and paint with them as well. So feel free to explore with those. And now I'm ready to transfer. So I'm going to transfer this onto one of my pieces of map paper, just because I think that would look nice. Same thing, I'm just going to lay it down. Being very gentle because this paper is fairly thin. It's not as thick as that watercolor paper that I was using. And lightly in a circular motion, we're going to transfer. And there's the results of that. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and print again. I'm going to lay another image on top, kind of soak up the rest of that watercolor. Again, that's called a ghost image. And a lot of times you'll like the ghost image more than your original. So I actually think that turned out better than my first one. And you might find that you want to create multiple ghost images. So I'm going to go ahead and lay this on top here again and just soak up the remaining of my watercolor. That's also giving me an interesting effect. So let's talk a little bit about cleanup when we're done with the printmaking process. A couple things here. Number one, the brushes that you used. They absolutely need to get cleaned and put back into your art kit. Okay, these are your brushes to keep all year long, although they will get returned to me at the end of the school year. So if you let them get hard, you will be charged for them. Okay, so make sure that you rinse them out and your palette knife. The water runs clear. And when you're finished with them, you're going to want to dry them off so they're not dripping wet, and put them back in your art kit or back on your shelf. Okay? Any other tools that you may have used. So if you use things to make texture, make sure that those things also get rinsed out, dried off, and put back where you found them. Your printing plate will also need to get cleaned off if it has paint or watercolor on it, which I'm sure it will. And this plastic plate will get placed over on the drying rack with all of the prints that you've made for today. I'll show you that in a second. If you got anything on your table, which I'm sure you will, paint, watercolor, make sure that that also gets wiped up before the end of the cleaning up process is going to involve putting your work over here on the drying rack. Okay. One thing to note is make sure that on the back of your monoprints is your name. That might be something you want to do before you actually print on the paper. Just label them all with your name and then print, because there's going to be tons of paper over here from your class and it may be difficult to remember which one is yours. So make sure that before you put on the drying rack, you go ahead and put your name on, and then it can slide right there into the drying rack. Another thing that can go on the drying rack is our plastic plate. So you can go ahead and just slide that also in the drying rack for when you need it the next time. Well, I hope that you enjoyed creating monoprints and learning about the process as much as I enjoyed showing it to you. You might be asking yourself, so like, what is the point of monoprinting? And that would be a great question. I'm going to show you some examples of some things that I've done with monoprints. And typically monoprints are used for backgrounds or for collage. A lot of artists will create monoprints and then draw or paint or create art on top of them. So let me show you some examples of what that might look like and how we might use these. Here's an example of a monoprint that I created many years ago, but this started out as just a simple print, I believe using watercolor, and then I texturized on top of it, and I drew using Sharpie and paint markers to create these jellyfish. So I really use the monoprint as a background source for my drawing. Here's a monoprint I did using watercolor that I think looks beautiful just in its own right without addressing any sort of drawing or anything on top of it. But here's an example of a monoprint that you might just use as a non-objective and